Stop. Stop and take a breath.
She needs to be locked up. She's dangerous.
Kelly had been shot in the face with a .30-30 rifle while he slept.
Some jet skis. That's what your life is worth.
It was a twisted mother-daughter relationship. You want to have sex with your boyfriend? Here's our house.
Who would do something like this?
She said, if I say anything about this, I will be next.
She is as close to demonically possessed as I've ever seen.
Hey, my stepson.
What's going on?
I think he's dead in the bed. I can't tell if he's been shot in the face or somebody hit him with something in the face, but it's all bloody as hell.
It was mid-morning. I was at home when dispatch contacted me, and there was some incident in the Cushing area.
Cushing's a very small town. It's one of those communities where you pretty well know everyone else. The victim's stepfather called 911.
They gave me the address. They said the James Kelly residence. I knew Mr. Kelly. James was a lifelong resident of Cushing. You have to prepare yourself in your mind on what you may see, especially when you know the victim. I arrived on scene. I met with Investigator Ball. I went into the bedroom.
The television was on, and I walked over to the bed. He was laying there under the cover, and I had to get up there pretty close, and I pulled the cover back. It was a mess.
A center point was punched in on the face, and everything exploded out, almost like putty.
The gunshot's been fired in a very close range. Something unique has occurred.
You see something horrific like this, and you realize you know that person, it becomes personal.
It was a very, very terrible day. Very terrible day. My stepdad, David, he said, there ain't no way to put it, but I believe your brother is no longer with us. He said that he had been shot. So I put my boots on and took off up there. And then you know, all the questions started running through my head. Who would do something like this?
We're dealing with an individual that has suffered a gunshot wound to the head and is deceased. Is this an accidental shooting? Is it a suicide? Or is it a homicide?
When the deputies get to the crime scene, they start looking around. Nothing is out of order. There hasn't been any sort of assault. There's no sign of forced entry.
As we're looking in the room, there was what appeared to be a handgun near the body. A gun laying on the floor in that position could lend itself to suicide.
There is no way he would do that. He had too much going for him.
But we're able to determine that's actually a pellet gun. It's not a firearm.
It could not have been a suicide.
It's very apparent that James was shot as he slept in bed. It's a murder. There's no way to call this anything else.
But he pretty well got along with everybody. As far as I knew, he did not have any enemies.
It was time to go to work for the family.
James was my little brother. We were 15 months apart, so pretty much where you seen one, you seen the other one. Everybody around here called us the Crazy Kelly Boys. We had a great childhood. We'd always go fishing, water skiing, kneeboarding.
So I've known him since he was a kid. He was kind of a daredevil.
If James seen a mud puddle, he's gonna step in it.
That was James. If he loved you, he loved you. He was gonna have your back.
James and his wife, Marseille, met at a party. James was 19 and Marseille was 22. Marseille had a big attitude. Just like James, she liked to race and drive fast, and, you know, if he thought that was sexy, Marseille did find him attractive.
They felt like they were a good couple when you seen them.
Marseille, she's notified that James has been shot.
She's at her place of employment when the call came in.
A friend of the family picks her up. They're driving towards Cushing when they get pulled over for speeding.
We call her fast driving down Northwest Highway that excess 90 miles an hour.
She is the one that exits the vehicle and then approaches the deputy before he can get out of the vehicle.
Okay, hang that, stop. Stop, take a breath.
She is just hysterical.
My brother-in-law told my husband that the cops just got her. They said he's safe.
Yelling, screaming.
Oh, man, there's your life. You don't want to get out.
The officer realizes something's happened to her husband and she needs to get to the scene. Then allows them to continue on.
She got back in the car and drove on to Cushing. James and Marseille, it was definitely an on-again, off-again relationship before they were married. They had both been in previous relationships. They were a blended family. James had 2 sons, and Marseille had 3 daughters. Marseille was a child herself when the oldest child, Shayna, was born.
I guess you could say Shayna was a typical teenager, you know.
Stepkids always have a hard time being introduced to a new dad.
But I could see the pride in his eyes when he talked about his stepkids. James kind of just treated them all like his.
He tried to give them everything that they wanted.
I could tell he loved them, and he loved Marseille.
James and Marseille, they end up getting married.
Oh, the wedding, it was real nice. All of his friends was there. It was real good. He was growing up, settling down, very proud of it. James started his own trucking business.
They had a number of vehicles. They had 4-wheelers, they had jet skis.
They seemed like a real happy family, you know. But you're on the outside looking in. What you see and what it really is kind of 2 different things.
It certainly wasn't all flowers, hearts, and unicorns.
James and Marseille seemed at times to be very tight, and then they seemed at times to be very apart. They may be arguing at each other at the mud park one night, and then the next time you see them, they're lovey-dovey that day. Just a roller coaster. For their kids, it wasn't necessarily a good thing.
We believed that Mr. Kelly was executed with the gunshot to the face.
As we're looking in the bedroom where Mr. Kelly was, we started taking photographs of the scene. We're still trying to determine clues. Then I spot a cell phone. It was lying on the floor near the foot of the bed. And something uniquely stands out to me. That call line on the end of the cell phone was still open. This is not normal. Why is it still openly engaged?
There's nothing to indicate that James was on the phone when he was killed. It's just plain weird.
Maybe there was a conversation taking place during the killing.
One possibility was that the killer had used that phone. When the police find James's phone with an open line, it's highly unusual.
We're going to get that telephone analyzed. Those phone records could hold some valuable information. Marseille arrives at home, but she gets out very calm and collected, very nonchalant.
Her behavior is very different from the way she had been acting when they were pulled over.
I didn't want to get home.
James is laying in the bed with his face shot half off, and she's just as calm as a cucumber.
This was really bizarre. She's not even asking questions. The rest of the family is very distraught, and Marseille goes and feeds the dogs.
It made me mad.
Is that all you can think about is your dogs?
Maybe she's just in so much shock that the body and the mind hasn't comprehended what happened yet.
We start talking to the witnesses and the neighbors and the family members.
The detective, Doug Richardson, took Marseille in the house, set her on the couch, and was asking her questions.
Marseille was employed at a local hospital. She tells me that she goes to work 6 o'clock at night, speaks to James 2 or 3 times, and James tells her, I want to wake up at 7:30, call me at 7:30 in the morning. Marseille said that she went to call the home phone, and once James didn't pick up the phone, she contacted James's stepfather.
My stepson, I think he's dead in the bed.
There is no doubt Marseille had a solid alibi for the time of this shooting. But James's death wasn't the first tragic death in Marseille's life.
There was a massive heat wave here in Texas.
Some sort of short in the electrical system caused the house to catch on fire. Both Marseille's mother and Marseille's middle child were killed in that fire.
Shayna was 6. Shayna was so distraught that she tried to end her own life, even as a child.
To lose your grandmother and your sibling, that's just a tragedy that most of us can't even imagine. And for Marseille, I can only imagine the tragedy of a mother losing their child.
After the fire, Marseille quit doing things a mom should do as far as guiding their child. She's just lost one kid, so she wants the other kid to be happy. Have whatever you want, girl. Go for it. But whatever Shayna wanted wasn't what she needed.
Marseille, she was asleep at the wheel. She had become a pretty sorry parent.
Once we saw the scene, we believed it was an execution-style shot for sure. When you're looking at the type of crime that we're looking at, everybody's a suspect. It's as important to see who is at the scene, but just as important is who's not at the scene.
The family has gathered around, close friends have gathered around, but Shayna's nowhere.
As we are collecting information from the individuals that are on the scene, we start to hear details about rebelliousness on his stepdaughter's part, conflicts between Mr. Kelly and Shayna.
People started coming forward and telling us Shayna hated James, hated him with a passion.
We needed to find Shayna.
Shayna wasn't the typical ideal student.
She was a wild child. She was the cool kid. She smoked. She drank. She had a boyfriend. She was 15 and had her own car, driving around with no driver's license.
She was just running wild.
Shayna didn't abide by nobody's rules but Shayna's.
Investigators pretty quickly realized that Marseille and Shayna, they didn't have a traditional mother-daughter relationship.
The relationship between Marseille and Shayna was friend, not mom and daughter.
Shayna's staying out all night, partying, not going to school.
James was not okay with Shayna hanging out, getting high, and drinking.
But her mother's validating all that behavior.
After that fire, the special relationship that Marseille and Shayna had was cemented. Marseille was letting Shayna run wild. She wouldn't put any limits on Shayna.
Marseille demonstrates bad parenting move after bad parenting move, and just when you think it couldn't possibly be any worse than it was, she makes this incredibly horrible parenting decision.
As we were investigating and interviewing, I discovered something shocking.
Marseille allowed her 15-year-old to be in a sexual relationship with an adult.
Shayna started a relationship with a Dallas Christian. He was 23 years old.
Dallas had a terrible reputation. Dallas was a sex offender. He was everything a mother would not want her daughter to be involved with.
He was a wannabe Billy Badass, a macho man. I don't think Marseille cared. Whatever was keeping Shayna quiet and keeping her pipe down.
Want to have sex with your boyfriend? Here's my house. Use it. Weird is an understatement for what this is. For her to show up with this sex offender, James, I'm sure, was livid about this situation. What do you do at this point as stepdad? Your authority's somewhat limited.
At one point, James took her car away from her. She was really pissed.
It just seemed like everything was getting worse and worse. Marseille and Shayna was definitely making it a nightmare for him.
James's stepdaughter, Shayna, was not on the scene.
Marseille told me that Shayna was at a friend's the night James was killed.
But when the police start looking into Shayna, they realize something important.
We conduct a background investigation on Shayna, and we find that she had been arrested for assault family violence. But it wasn't with her stepfather, James. The incident was between her and her mother.
There'd been some blow up over whether or not Shayna was going to clean her room.
It was like a match to kindling. It just lit up.
Shayna lost her temper. She shoved Marseille, pushed her into a glass door.
You know, there's blows exchanged, pushing and shoving and punching.
Two strong, tough women going at it. You probably could have sold that as a main event somewhere.
She spent the night in jail.
Shayna ends up on juvenile probation.
And Shayna was so out of control. She was getting closer to the edge.
Shayna became a huge source of tension for James and Marseille.
James and Marseille, they butted heads more and more. Marseille was a rebel. She didn't change her lifestyle after she had the kids. She still, went out, partied, smoking and drinking. It was getting bad. James felt like it was 2 against 1.
The whole dynamics was probably just a powder keg ready to explode. Shayna's violent. She's on probation. We needed to find Shayna. It's very imperative that we speak to her.
Law enforcement locates her with Dallas Christian.
They're not aware that they're being looked at as potential suspects.
The two of them go to the sheriff's department to talk to the investigators.
I interviewed Shayna first.
When I called him this morning, nobody would tell me what happened to him.
Where were you at yesterday?
Yeah, I went home last night about 9 o'clock and got my clothes. I sat down with my dad and we talked for a little while. And I asked him, could I go stay at a friend's house? We just talked. He was like apologizing to me for the way he talks to me, and I apologized for the way I talked to him. And that's the last time I talked to my dad.
Once I established the baseline story with Shayna, I went and interviewed Dallas.
Only tell the truth. That's all I'm gonna do. When you gonna start? Right now?
He's nervous.
We start to see anomalies in their stories where the accounts that they're giving don't match each other.
To me, it just signs of deception. I've been around Dallas a bunch, and so, I don't know if I can say this, but that kid's too dumb to lie.
I don't think you're giving us the story as it unfolded Saturday night. I'd have to say I'm calling bullshit on you.
I press him on what he knows about the death of James. Now we're getting down to the meat and bones of this. That's when now Colton Weir enters the picture.
That Sunday morning, Colton came to my door at 7 o'clock in the morning, knocked on the door, and told me, don't worry about James killing no more.
Dallas tells me that Colton says something to the effect that James is dead and I got rid of the gun.
This is huge. This is the moment they've been waiting for. Investigators learned Colton was a little high school friend of Shayna's. He wanted to be part of Shayna's crowd. I always suspected that Colton kind of had a crush on Shayna.
Colton was a really rough kid. I didn't really ever like being around Colton. He always made me very uncomfortable. There was something a bit creepy about Dallas and Colton. I just knew they were bad people and I didn't want to be around them.
We pick up 15-year-old Colton Weir. We come back to the sheriff's office. He's very quiet, head down, no eye contact.
I believe you're a smart enough kid to know what you're in here for. Yes, sir.
I tell him that it's just best to tell the truth. I took my chair and moved in closer.
I have to look in your face and I can tell that you need to get it off your chest. It's eating you alive and you need to talk to me about it. Get it off your chest, son. Tell me what happened. Yes, sir, I will.
Colton's interview turned out to be critical.
Go ahead and let's finish out the story.
She was looking for somebody to do it.
It was the key that opened everything. He pointed the finger at Shayna.
My story is that I was with my friends, Shawnee River Bottom.
It wasn't just Colton and Dallas at the Shawnee River bottom.
You're telling me that you stayed at the river bottom with Shayna?
Yes, sir.
Colton confirms that Shayna was with Colton and Dallas too.
They put the rifle in the trunk of Shayna's car and they take off for the Kelly residence.
Dallas Christian is the driver of the car. Shayna was in the front seat.
I got there at the house.
And you got out of the car with the gun?
Yes.
Shayna leads Colton to the house, lets Colton in, shows him where James is asleep.
So where was James at when you went in the house?
In his bed.
Did you go in that house with the gun and shoot James Kelly?
Colton's head immediately went down. His hands were by his face, and he nodded.
Where did you shoot him at? Are you pointing between the nose or between the eyes?
Just clean.
Colton shoots James Kelly one time in the face.
After you shot, what did you do?
Ran as fast as I could because I was scared.
This is that television moment. The sheriff's deputies, they've got a shooter that's confessed, and they realize that we're dealing with premeditated murder of James by a group of people led by Shayna.
Shayna's the one that brought every one of these guys into this scheme of hers to kill James.
Shayna's motivation to having James killed was get him out of the picture. I have no person to stop me from doing whatever I want to do. Unbelievable. We knew we had the willing participants in this, but we think there's more to the story.
Okay, hang tight.
According to his family friend who brought Marseille home,
Stop, take a breath.
Marseille's behavior was very different from the way she had been acting inside the car before they were pulled over.
I'm sorry for your loss. Y'all feel that?
The family friend said she had been very calm about things up until then. That sudden change in behavior is very strange.
Her behavior was flipping.
And then as the police go back and start talking to Dallas, they realize a shocking truth about who planned this execution of James Kelly.
You're gonna need to come straight. You need to tell us how it got planned.
Marseille said she wants to kill him. She offered me money, truck, and
It's like, aha. Shayna wasn't the mastermind. This mother and daughter have conspired to kill James.
But it was the mother leading the child.
Shayna's mother, Marseille, was the mastermind. It's crazy.
We find out that Marseille had offered $10,000, jet skis, 18-wheelers, and all kinds of other miscellaneous items for James's murder.
Jaw-dropping. I mean, a jet ski.
I was like, oh gosh. I mean, that's it. That's what your life is worth. That's what the woman that you married said, I do. That's what you're valued at. A few $1,000s and some jet skis.
A mother offering to pay her child's friends to kill her husband.
That disgusts me. It's sickening.
Now's the real moment of truth, but yet she had a solid alibi.
We quickly needed to get Marseille to our office for an interview.
These kids are saying you talked to them and you offered them money.
Well, I don't know where they got it or why they're saying it.
There's an almost absence of emotion, just pretty nonchalant.
I don't understand where they're coming from.
She could show some signs of intelligence, but she could also play dumb and confused.
And there are enough statements saying, would you take care of this for me? I need him dead.
I don't know who I said that to or when I would have said that to somebody. I just don't think I've been that mad at him to ask somebody to kill him.
She tried to minimize by just downplaying, oh, well, yeah, they know I wasn't serious. We didn't have any real facts linking Marseille Kelly with the crime that was committed. But we started getting the cell phone records and we're able to corroborate what they're telling us.
I realized how much of a hold Marseille had on Shayna.
It is now unquestionable that in the hours leading up to James's murder, that Shayna and Marseille are talking to each other.
We find out those calls are to see when James has actually gone to bed so that the plan can be acted out. And then there was this mystery of the open cell phone lying on the floor near the foot of the bed.
The investigators pretty quickly realized a shocking truth.
I don't even think the devil would be that evil.
When the deputies are looking at the crime scene, one of the things they find is James's cell phone with an open line. It turned out to be a call to Marseille. But James didn't call anybody. Shayna did.
It is truly our belief that Marseille was trying to hear the gunshot to know it happened.
Marseille didn't have a conscience, nothing. Just pure evil.
During the investigation, we found a very clear motive.
Marseille stood to come out of this with a lot of money. There was a life insurance policy, they owned multiple vehicles, and she could take this money and just move on. And to Shayna, James was the one thing standing between her and freedom.
She's probably just thinking, I can get rid of Mom's problem and my problem once James is gone.
Marseille knew she could get Shayna to do stuff like that.
Just kind of flabbergasted how it all came to a head, right under your nose.
She hasn't seen a murder in more than 15 years. But the people here were especially outraged when they found out it appeared to be a murder for hire.
Marseille and Shayna, Dallas and Colton get arrested, and they're all four charged with capital murder. But there was a problem. Marseille, she had a solid alibi for the time of this shooting.
She had plausible deniability simply because, well, I can prove I was at work when this happened.
We're unsure if we have enough evidence to convict Marseille of this crime.
But all of a sudden, people start showing up at the sheriff's department. These really shocking allegations start appearing.
Marseille had solicited them with the same type of items as payment. Money, jet skis, 18-wheelers.
There was one young man who said, she took me in the closet and we had this conversation where she asked me if I would kill James.
She asked me if I would do it. And I told her she was out of her mind.
Here's Marseille sitting in a courtroom with basically her life on the line. Marseille's defense was, I didn't have anything to do with this. Dallas and Colton and Shayna did this. And then there was a big twist. Shayna does something I hadn't anticipated.
Marseille convinced her daughter to testify for her mom. I told Shayna she was making the worst mistake of her entire life.
Shayna testified my mom didn't know anything. This daughter was willing to risk her own freedom, was willing to lie for her mom, and her mom was willing to let her do that.
Marseille, she was more than willing to throw Shayna under the bus and say, that's the guilty party, and yes, she inspired these others to do it. I didn't have anything to do with it.
A terrible mother. A terrible mother.
She's heartless. She is as close to demonically possessed as I've ever seen.
It felt like, somebody just hit me in the gut. I would like to see Marseille and Shayna fry. That would make me feel a little better.
But it didn't work. We end up having more than sufficient evidence to convict Marseille. The verdict is guilty. Marseille is sentenced to life without parole.
At Shayna's trial, Marseille Kelly, she never, ever tried to take any of the heat off of her daughter.
Marseille put Shayna out to dry. Most parents would stand up and say, no, 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 no. Marseille was too busy trying to cover her butt.
Shayna got exactly what she deserved for taking James Kelly's life.
greed and selfishness in the form of Marcy Kelly is what led to James's death.
A man is dead. And for what? This mother and daughter, they were master manipulators. But I put all the blame on Marcy as the mastermind of this. The buck started and stopped with her. Hopefully they'll stay exactly where they're at the rest of their lives. We don't need people like that out.
I miss James a whole lot. The little phone calls, shooting the breeze, I miss it.
The rain had stopped 5 minutes before the scream was heard. Not the kind of scream that echoes. Not the kind that alerts the whole street. Just a sharp break in the night air, swallowed almost instantly by the hum of late buses and the dull glow of sodium streetlights. By the time anyone looked out their window, London had already moved on. October 1987. A city obsessed with speed, with money, with headlines about stock markets collapsing and futures disappearing overnight. In a narrow side street near Camden, something else collapsed quietly. A life, a routine, a sense of safety that would never fully return. The woman's name would not appear in the morning papers until 2 days later. By then, the story had already begun to rot. She was 26, worked late, walked home alone, did everything right. No criminal record, no known enemies, no history that made sense of what happened next. Her body was found wedged between 2 parked cars, jacket half open, 1 shoe missing, skin cold to the touch, but hands still curled as if grasping for something that never arrived. No witnesses, no murder weapon, no clear cause of death at first glance. The responding officers thought it might be another overdose. Another tragic statistic. Another name that would vanish into the city's bloodstream. Then they turned her over, and London briefly stopped breathing. There were marks on her neck. Not clean, not symmetrical. Fingers, maybe. Or something improvised. Something panicked. The pathologist would later describe it as inconclusive strangulation, a phrase that satisfied no one and haunted everyone involved for decades. By sunrise, the street had been scrubbed. Rain returned, conveniently erasing footprints that had never been photographed. A neighbor reported hearing footsteps running, then nothing. Another claimed to see a man in a dark coat, but in London, that narrowed it down to half the population. Cold case. Before the term became fashionable, before podcasts, before dramatizations, just a folder. Thin. Already yellowing. Detectives canvassed the area, knocked on doors that didn't open, collected statements that contradicted each other within minutes. A man at the corner shop said he saw her buy cigarettes. Another insisted she didn't smoke. Her handbag was missing. Never recovered. No bank cards used. No ransom call. No message. Her flat told its own quiet story. Bed unmade. Kettle cold. A note stuck to the fridge. Back late. Don't wait. Someone had waited. The first suspect emerged within 48 hours. A former boyfriend. Recently separated. Known for temper, according to friends who spoke too eagerly. He was questioned. Released. Questioned again. Released again. No DNA. Not in 1987. No CCTV. Not yet. No mobile phone records. Those belong to the future. What they did have was pressure. From above. From the public. From a city that wanted neat endings. So the case drifted. Weeks turned into months. Months into years. The detectives changed. The neighborhood changed. The memory didn't. Every so often, a tip would come in. Anonymous calls. Rumors whispered in pubs. A taxi driver who thought he recognized the description. A woman who swore she saw the victim arguing with someone near the station. Nothing stuck. By the early 90s, the file had grown thick with dead ends. Red ink. Crossed out names. Arrows pointing nowhere. Cold case. The family never accepted the word. They kept the light on in the hallway of the old house. Kept her room exactly the same. Kept asking the same question at anniversaries and press appeals. Who followed her home that night? Who knew her route? Who knew she was alone? London swallowed the answers. Then, in 2023, a junior analyst reopened the file. Not because of a confession. Not because of a witness. Because of a line that had been overlooked for 36 years. A receipt. Time-stamped. Filed incorrectly. A detail so small it had survived untouched while everything else decayed. And suddenly, the past wasn't past anymore. Because some cold cases don't fade. They wait. The receipt was no bigger than a matchstick, curled at the edges, stained with time and fingerprints that no one in 1987 had thought worth preserving. It had been logged as irrelevant, stuffed behind a witness statement, misdated, misfiled, forgotten. A purchase made at 2243. Milk. Cigarettes. A newspaper. The shop was 3 streets away from where her body was found, but crucially, it was not on her usual route home. It suggested hesitation. A detour. A moment when routine cracked just enough for fate to slip through. The analyst noticed something else. The cashier's initials. The till number. The shift schedule. The man working that register that night had given a statement back in 1987, a short one, barely a paragraph. He claimed she came in alone, paid in cash, left calmly. No sign of distress. Nothing memorable. Case closed as far as he was concerned. But memory is a strange accomplice. It edits. It erases. It protects. The analyst requested the original tapes from the shop's back room, a long shot, almost a joke. Everyone assumed they were gone. Destroyed in a flood. Recorded over. Lost to time. Except they weren't. They'd been boxed, mislabeled, shoved onto a shelf when the shop changed owners in the early 90s. Dust thick enough to write names in. Tapes brittle but intact. When the footage was finally played, the room went quiet. The image was grainy, black and white. A fixed angle that caught the counter. The door, a sliver of pavement outside. At 2242, she stepped into frame. Head down. Coat buttoned. Hair damp from the rain. She moved with the tired efficiency of someone counting minutes until home. She placed the items on the counter, reached into her bag. Then, just before paying, she glanced over her shoulder. Not casually. Not politely. A sharp look. A flinch. The door opened again. A man entered. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Dark coat. The kind of silhouette that dissolved into London crowds without effort. He did not stand close to her, but he stood close enough. Too close for strangers. The cashier looked up. Hesitated. The tape skipped for half a second, then resumed. The man paid for nothing. He left without buying anything. She followed 10 seconds later. 10 seconds that would stretch into 36 years. No one had mentioned him in the original reports. Not the cashier. Not the officers. Not the neighbors. He existed only in that fragment of footage. When the image was enhanced, frame by frame, more details emerged. A ring on his right hand. Unusual. A signet, maybe. A scar near the jawline. And something else. A limp. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. But once seen, impossible to ignore. The analyst sent the clip upstairs. Suddenly, the cold case wasn't cold anymore. Detectives compared the man's walk to archived footage from unrelated cases. Assaults. Muggings. A handful of unsolved incidents from the late 80s clustered in the same borough. Women followed. Corners chosen carefully. No witnesses. No forensic breakthroughs. Just fear, spreading quietly through neighborhoods that learned to walk faster at night. A pattern began to form. In 1989, another woman reported being followed from a shop 2 streets from the first. She escaped by ducking into a pub. Her description matched the silhouette almost exactly. Tall. Dark coat. Limp. Ring. The report had been dismissed as anxiety. No crime committed. No case number assigned. In 1991, a sex worker was found strangled near King's Cross. Different circumstances. Different life. Same marks on the neck. The file noted possible manual pressure, then moved on. The city had connected nothing. Technology did. Facial recognition struggled with the footage. Too old. Too degraded. But gait analysis did better. Combined with the ring, the limp, the geography, the pool narrowed to a few hundred men. Then dozens. Then less than 10. One name sat at the center of the web. He had lived less than a mile from the shop in 1987. Worked nights. Changed addresses frequently. No criminal record for violent offenses. Several arrests for disorderly conduct. Bar fights. One unexplained injury to his left leg, recorded in hospital files after a fall in 1986. He had been interviewed once, briefly, as part of a door-to-door sweep. His statement was clean. Too clean. He claimed he'd been home that night, alone, listening to the radio. No one had pressed him. No reason to. Until now. Detectives knocked on his door in the summer of 2023. A quiet cul-de-sac. Trimmed hedges. A life that looked, from the outside, unremarkable. He was in his 70s now. Hair thin. Hands steady. The ring still on his finger. When they asked about 1987, his smile faltered. He said he didn't remember. Then said he remembered too well. Then asked if this was about that girl. 3 words that shifted the air in the room. He agreed to come in for questioning. Voluntarily. Calmly. He joked about memory playing tricks. About how the past had a way of resurfacing. His tone suggested nostalgia, not fear. In the interview room, the footage was played. Once. Twice. 3 times. On the 4th viewing, his foot tapped in rhythm with the limp on screen. He stared at the monitor, eyes narrowing, then laughed. A short, brittle sound. He said lots of men wore dark coats back then. Said London was full of limps. Full of rings. Full of ghosts. Then the detective paused the tape. Zoomed in on the ring. The signet bore a crest. Rare. Custom-made. Commissioned in the late 70s by a jeweler in Soho who kept meticulous records. The receipt still existed. The name matched. For the first time in 36 years, the room felt smaller. They arrested him that afternoon. The headline broke within hours. London 1987 cold case reopened. Surprise arrest after 36 years. Phones rang. Families cried. Reporters camped outside houses that hadn't mattered since Thatcher was in office. But an arrest is not an ending. It is a door opening onto darker rooms. Because when they searched his home, they found nothing conclusive. No trophies. No weapons. No diaries. Just boxes of newspapers. Decades of them. Carefully stacked. Headlines circled in red. Stories about disappearances. About women found dead. About investigations that went nowhere. On one article, dated 2 days after her death, a single word was underlined. Unknown. And beneath it, in handwriting that matched the hospital intake form from 1986, a note had been added. Not to me. The city held its breath again. Because the past, once disturbed, does not stay buried. And this case, after 36 years of silence, was only just beginning to speak. They questioned him through the night, the hours stretching thin and brittle under fluorescent light, every answer measured, every pause catalogued, the tape recorder humming like an insect that never slept. He never asked for a lawyer. Not once. He leaned back in the chair, hands folded, ring catching the light each time he shifted, and spoke as if recounting a story he had rehearsed alone for decades. He said he walked those streets often in the 80s. Everyone did. He said he remembered the shop, remembered buying cigarettes there sometimes, but not that night. No, definitely not that night. He said the woman on the tape looked tired. He said London was a hard place for tired people back then. When pressed about the note in the newspaper, he smiled again, smaller this time, and said people underlined strange things when they read. It didn't mean anything. It meant curiosity. It meant boredom. It meant nothing at all. But nothing after 36 years had finally started to look like something. Forensic teams returned to the original scene, a ritual more symbolic than practical. The street had changed names twice. The buildings had been renovated, the asphalt resurfaced, the lamppost replaced. Still, they stood there at night, measuring distances, tracing sight lines, imagining footsteps that no one had heard clearly enough to describe. They noted how the alley swallowed sound, how the corner bent just enough to hide movement from the main road, how 10 seconds could stretch into opportunity. Back at the lab, technicians re-examined the evidence that had survived. Fibers sealed in outdated bags. Swabs taken with methods no one used anymore. Fingernail scrapings once declared useless. They applied modern techniques to old mistakes, coaxing whispers out of silence. A partial profile emerged. Incomplete. Fragile. But real. It did not exclude him. The media filled the gaps faster than the science could. Neighbors gave interviews about how quiet he was, how polite, how he always waved. Old acquaintances remembered bar fights, sudden flashes of anger, a temper that flared and vanished just as quickly. A former girlfriend, tracked down after weeks of searching, described the way he used to grip her wrist when he was upset. Not hard enough to bruise, she said. Just enough to remind her he was there. She had never reported it. No one had asked. The prosecution built a timeline from fragments. The receipt. The footage. The detour. His proximity. His silence. They placed him behind her in the shop, 10 seconds back, matching pace, watching her reflection in the glass. They imagined him following her into the rain, choosing the street without cameras, without witnesses, without escape. They imagined an argument that lasted less than a minute. A shove. A grip that went too far. Panic. Darkness. The defense dismantled it with equal precision. No direct evidence. No eyewitnesses. No confession. A partial DNA profile that could belong to thousands. A video too grainy to identify conclusively. A limp that could be coincidence. A ring that proved ownership, not violence. In court, the footage was played again and again. Jurors leaned forward, squinting at the screen, searching for certainty in static and shadow. Each viewing made the man on tape feel both more familiar and more elusive, like a face glimpsed in a crowd that dissolves the moment you think you've recognized it. The family sat behind the prosecution, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the monitor. For them, time had never moved. 36 years had passed, but the night she didn't come home still lived in the present tense. Then came the witness no one expected. A retired bus driver, living in Kent now, watching the news when the arrest was announced. He saw the footage. He saw the limp. He saw the ring flash under the shop light, and something in his chest tightened. He called the tip line, voice shaking, apologizing before he even explained why. He said he had been on his last route that night in 1987. He said he remembered a woman running. He hadn't thought about it in years because no one had ever asked him. She had waved down the bus near Camden Road, breathless, terrified, saying someone was following her. He had told her to get on, but before she did, she looked back down the street, hesitated, and said she'd dropped something. She turned and ran back into the dark. He waited. She never returned. At the time, he assumed she'd changed her mind. London was full of strange moments that never came with explanations. He finished his route. He went home. He slept. The defense tore into his memory. Decades old. Uncorroborated. Contaminated by headlines and hindsight. The prosecution countered with route logs, confirming a bus had stopped at that location within minutes of the estimated time of death. The courtroom shifted. But the case refused to settle into clarity. For every piece that clicked, another slipped out of reach. The partial DNA degraded under retesting. The pathologist from 1987, now elderly, admitted under oath that standards were different back then, that conclusions were sometimes shaped by pressure rather than certainty. The marks on her neck could not be dated precisely, could not be attributed definitively. Outside, public opinion fractured. Some called him a monster who had hidden in plain sight. Others warned against nostalgia-driven justice, against trying to force resolution onto a past that no longer existed. And then, in the fourth week of trial, something unexpected happened. The defendant collapsed. Not theatrically, not convincingly, just suddenly. An ambulance. A pause. Murmurs rippling through the gallery. He was diagnosed with a minor stroke. Recovery likely. Ability to stand trial uncertain. Proceedings were suspended. The city exhaled, confused and unsatisfied. In the quiet that followed, investigators returned to the boxes of newspapers found in his home. They read them slowly this time, not as trophies, but as a map. Dates. Locations. Margins filled with numbers. Some circled. Some crossed out. A private ledger written in ink and obsession. One article, buried near the bottom of a stack, caught a young detective's eye. A brief report. No photo. A woman assaulted but surviving, 1988, less than a mile from the original scene. The suspect description was vague, but the location was exact. The woman had scratched her attacker's face. Hospital records from that year showed a man treated for a deep scratch along his jawline. Same jaw. Same scar visible on the tape. The date matched. The detective closed the file slowly. Because patterns once seen do not disappear. And because the past, even when it refuses to confess, leaves marks. Marks that wait. The trial resumed without him, or rather around the absence he left behind, a chair now empty, but still heavy with implication. Medical reports were read aloud in flat voices, doctors explaining blood flow and recovery windows, the fragile line between competence and collapse. The judge allowed proceedings to continue in a reduced capacity, testimony taken, arguments preserved, as if time itself might run out before truth did. Outside the courthouse, rain returned, persistent, familiar, the same gray curtain that had fallen over the city in 1987. Reporters clustered under umbrellas, repeating the same phrases into microphones. Cold case. Breakthrough. Justice delayed. Justice denied. None of them fit quite right. Inside, the bus driver testified again, this time with diagrams, with dates, with the slow care of a man trying to hold onto a memory that had waited too long to be useful. He described the woman's eyes. Wide. Fixed. Not drunk. Not confused. Afraid. He described the way she kept looking over her shoulder, counting steps, calculating distance. He described the moment she chose the dark over the bus, the known over the unknown, the terrible logic of fear. The defense suggested false memory, the brain filling gaps with headlines, the human need to matter, to be part of a story. The driver shook his head, hands trembling, and said he wished he'd been wrong for 36 years. He said he wished the phone had never rung. Then came the jeweler. An old man now, voice thin but precise, who remembered the ring because it had been unusual even then. A signet commissioned by a man who wanted something that looked old, authoritative, untraceable. The crest wasn't a family symbol. It was invented, chosen for weight, not meaning. The jeweler produced the original sketch. The lines matched the ring on the defendant's finger exactly. There were no duplicates. No replicas. One piece. One owner. The defense objected. Ownership was not guilt. The judge agreed. The jury listened anyway. Forensics followed, a parade of caveats and cautious language. A partial DNA profile that could not exclude him, but could not indict him either. Fibers consistent with his coat, a common make sold by the thousands. Soiled traces inconclusive. Fingernail scrapings contaminated by time and handling. Each expert ended the same way, eyes down, voice steady, reminding the court of limitations. Limitations had defined this case from the beginning. Then the prosecution introduced a new timeline. They traced his movements through employment records, pub receipts, witness statements. They placed him near the shop that night, near the street, near the moment when 10 seconds became fatal. They showed how he had changed jobs abruptly 2 weeks later, how he'd moved flats within a month, how he'd sold the coat identified on the tape at a secondhand market, a detail recovered from a vendor's logbook that had somehow survived. The defense called it coincidence. The city was full of movement in the late 80s. People left jobs. People moved. People sold clothes. The jury watched, waited, counted days. And then the prosecution played a recording that had never been meant for court. It was an interview from 1987, unearthed from an archive mislabeled and ignored. The defendant's voice, younger, sharper, answering routine questions from a bored constable. Where were you that night? What time did you get home? Did you see anything unusual? On the tape, he laughed. Not loudly, not nervously, briefly, as if amused. At the time, no one noticed. Now, in the stillness of the courtroom, the sound landed differently. The prosecution replayed it, slowed it, asked an audio analyst to explain microexpressions in speech, stress markers, shifts in tone. The expert spoke carefully, refusing certainty, but noting incongruence. Amusement where none should exist. Comfort where fear might be expected. The defense stood and objected again. Speculation. Pseudoscience. The judge allowed it, then reminded the jury that interpretation was theirs alone. Days blurred together. Testimony. Recess. Argument. Silence. In the middle of the 6th week, the defendant returned to court. Pale. Slower. The limp more pronounced now, no longer something to debate. He sat through proceedings with a blank expression, eyes unfocused, as if already halfway elsewhere. When asked if he wished to testify, he declined. When asked if he understood the charges, he nodded once. Outside, the family waited. 36 years of waiting condensed into hours that refused to move. The closing arguments were sharp, restrained, almost weary. The prosecution spoke of patterns, of waiting, of how violence rarely announces itself loudly, how it hides in routines, in habits, in streets we think we know. The defense spoke of doubt, of the danger of forcing answers onto incomplete questions, of the responsibility to protect the living from the mistakes of the past. The jury retired. They deliberated for 4 days. On the 5th morning, the foreperson stood, hands shaking, and delivered a verdict that landed like a dull thud rather than a crash. Not guilty. Not innocent. Not exonerated. Not guilty. A legal answer to a human question that remained wide open. The defendant showed no reaction. No relief. No triumph. Just a slow exhale, as if a weight he'd been carrying had shifted, not lifted. He left the courtroom through a side door, shielded from cameras, disappearing once again into the ordinary machinery of the city. The family stayed seated long after everyone else had gone. There was no outburst, no collapse, just the quiet understanding that something had ended without resolving anything at all. The headlines changed tone overnight. Case collapses. Evidence insufficient. Cold case returns to shadows. But the investigation did not close. Not this time. Detectives, freed from the constraints of prosecution, followed the ledger in the newspapers further. They mapped dates, cross-referenced assaults, found similarities that had once been dismissed because victims didn't fit the same narrative. Different ages, different backgrounds, same streets, same hours, same method. They spoke to women who had never spoken to police before, who had been followed, grabbed, threatened, let go. They described a man who liked to stand just behind them, who liked to whisper directions, who liked control more than violence. One woman described a ring. Another described a limp. None of it was enough for court. All of it was enough to change how the case was remembered. The defendant died 2 years later. Quietly, at home, in his sleep. No confession. No note. No final revelation. His estate was catalogued. His belongings dispersed. The ring vanished somewhere between evidence storage and probate, lost again to bureaucracy and time. The cold case unit updated the file one last time. Status: unresolved. But unresolved does not mean untouched. Because even without a conviction, the story shifted. The city remembered differently. The street no longer felt anonymous. The 10 seconds outside the shop were no longer empty. They were filled with footsteps, with choice, with the sound of someone deciding, in the dark, that no one was watching. And London, which had swallowed the truth once before, did not entirely succeed in doing so again. The past had spoken, just not loudly enough. Time did what the verdict could not. It dulled outrage into discomfort, turned anger into a quieter, more persistent take. The street returned to its routines. New tenants learned the quickest way to the station. The shop became something else, then something else again. The bus stop moved 20 meters south. London kept rearranging itself, as if geometry alone could erase memory. Inside the cold case unit, the file stayed open. Not active. Not closed. Suspended in a state that only unsolved crimes ever occupy. Detectives rotated in and out. Names on the cover changed. The weight did not. In 2026, a graduate student researching urban violence in the late 20th century requested access to archived assault reports. Her interest was academic. Patterns. Language. The way institutions described victims depending on who they were and where they lived. She wasn't looking for answers. She wasn't looking for this case at all. She found it anyway. What caught her attention wasn't the murder file. It was a cluster of non-fatal incidents between 1986 and 1992, all coded differently, all filed under minor offenses. Harassment, attempted assault, public order disturbances. They shared nothing on paper. Different officers, different phrasing, different outcomes. But the locations overlapped. And so did the timing. Late evenings, rainy nights, short walks between public places and private safety. The reports often mentioned hesitation, turning back, dropping something, changing route. One phrase appeared twice, written by different officers years apart. He seemed to enjoy being just behind her. The student flagged the reports and sent a note to the unit. It landed on the desk of a detective 2 months from retirement, a man who had inherited more cold cases than he'd ever solved. He read the line once, then again, then pulled the London map from storage. He marked every incident. The pattern tightened. It was not a spree. It was not escalation. It was repetition. The same streets, the same windows of time, the same almosts. Almost grabbed, almost dragged, almost killed. The detective requested original witness statements. Handwritten ones. The kind that never made it into databases. In the margins, he found what computers had stripped away. Descriptions scribbled in frustration. Small drawings. A ring. A hand. A limp. One statement ended with a sentence the officer had crossed out. I think he wanted her to know he could. The unit reopened parallel files quietly. No press. No announcements. They spoke to survivors now in their 50s and 60s, people who had built lives around an event they'd once been told was insignificant. Some cried. Some laughed. Some apologized for wasting police time back then. They described the same man. Not violent in the way headlines imagine. Deliberate. Patient. Careful. He liked the moment before fear tipped into chaos. He liked proximity. He liked control without witnesses. He liked leaving marks that could be explained away. One woman remembered his voice. Calm. Instructive. Telling her which way to walk. Telling her not to run. She complied because she believed, in that moment, that obedience might keep her alive. When a car turned the corner, he stepped back. Melted away. The encounter ended without a crime, without a case, without justice. The detective compared timelines. The attack stopped around the same time the defendant's health began to decline. Hospital visits increased. Mobility decreased. The limp worsened. The streets narrowed. Correlation is not proof. But it is not nothing. They searched for a confession that never came. For a diary. For a recording. They found none. What they found instead was absence. Decades of carefully managed normality. No friends close enough to notice patterns. No partners long enough to ask questions. A life designed to leave no residue. Except it had. In a storage unit scheduled for clearance, a box surfaced. Unclaimed. Paid for in cash until the year before his death. Inside were items that did not belong together. Old coats. Shoes worn unevenly. A notebook filled with maps, streets circled, dates written and crossed out. Not victims' names. Just locations. On one page, a single line was written in block letters. Wait until it's quiet. The handwriting matched the note under the newspaper headline. The evidence was circumstantial. Too late. Too incomplete. The case could not be reopened against a dead man. There would be no trial. No verdict. No official conclusion. But the unit prepared a report anyway. Internal. Careful. Unpublished. It outlined a likely offender responsible for multiple assaults and one suspected homicide. It acknowledged uncertainty. It acknowledged failure. It ended with a sentence that would never be read aloud in court. We believe the victim was not chosen at random. That belief shifted everything. They revisited her life not as a list of facts, but as a sequence of vulnerabilities. Her route home, her habits, her timing, her decision to stop at a shop she didn't usually visit. A moment of deviation that intersected with someone else's routine. Chance met patience. The family was informed quietly. There was no apology that could fill the space of 36 years. No language for closure that did not sound like an excuse. They listened, asked a few questions, then asked one that no report could answer. Why her? The detective had no response that would not sound hollow. Because sometimes the truth is not hidden. It is simply unbearable in its simplicity. Because she was there. Because he was watching. Because the street was empty enough. The case remained unresolved on paper. But in the minds of those who had followed it, something had finally aligned. The fragments did not form a neat picture. They formed a shadow. And the shadow at last had a shape. London did not announce it. It never does. But the city adjusted its memory. And the silence around that night became less about forgetting and more about recognition. A recognition that came too late to save one life, but not too late to name the pattern that took it. The cold case stayed cold. But it was no longer mute. The report was sealed, stamped, archived, its conclusions locked behind language designed to be cautious and unprovable. Likely. Probable. Consistent with. Words that carry weight only for those who have learned to read between them. Officially, nothing changed. Unofficially, everything did. Inside the unit, the case stopped being referred to by her name. It became shorthand. A look exchanged in meetings. A pause when new files crossed old streets. A reminder that some crimes don't announce themselves as singular events, but as habits. As rhythms that blend into the noise of a city too busy to notice repetition. The graduate student finished her thesis and moved on. She would later say she hadn't realized what she'd found at the time. Only that something in those reports felt wrong. Too calm. Too minimized. Language sanding down fear until it fit into a box labeled minor. Language had failed first. Years later, another woman would read the file for a different reason. A journalist, researching how cold cases reshape public trust. She expected statistics. She found margins. Handwritten notes. The crossed-out sentence about control. The maps. The waiting. She requested interviews. The cold case unit declined. The family declined. Most survivors declined. One agreed. She was in her early 60s now, living far from London, her accent softened by time and distance. She described the night in fragments, not because she couldn't remember, but because memory refused to organize itself neatly. She remembered the rain, the sound of her shoes, the way she felt suddenly observed without seeing anyone. She remembered him stepping close enough that she could smell soap on his coat. Ordinary. Clean. Disarming. She remembered him saying, calmly, almost kindly, "Don't run. You'll fall." She remembered believing him. When asked why she hadn't gone to the police at the time, she laughed once, bitter and brief. She said she did. She said they told her nothing had happened. No injury. No theft. No witness. She was advised to be more careful. Careful had become a life strategy after that. The journalist never published the interview. Not as a feature. Not as a headline. She folded it into a longer piece about how crimes without spectacle disappear. How the absence of blood can erase danger. How predators learn the limits of attention and stay just inside them. The article ran quietly. It didn't go viral, but it reached the right people. One of them was a forensic psychologist who specialized in historical offender behavior. He contacted the unit with a profile, unsolicited, unpaid, almost apologetic. He described a man driven not by rage, but by rehearsal. Someone who practiced control in increments. Someone who needed acknowledgement more than harm. Someone who escalated only when conditions were perfect, then retreated into waiting again. He described the murder as an anomaly. Not because it didn't fit, but because it went too far. An accident of pressure. A grip held too long. A moment when control slipped. The psychologist ended his note with a sentence that stayed with the detective long after. People like this don't stop because they feel guilt. They stop because the environment changes. Age. Health. Visibility. The environment had changed. The detective retired that winter. On his last day, he walked the street one final time. Not ceremonially. Not officially. Just alone, hands in his coat pockets, counting steps. He stood where the shop had been, now a cafe, with warm light spilling onto the pavement. He stood where the alley bent. He stood where a bus stop used to be. He tried to imagine 10 seconds. Not as evidence. Not as theory. As experience. He imagined her leaving the shop. The door closing behind her. The awareness blooming too late. He imagined footsteps matching hers, close enough to hear breathing. He imagined the choice at the corner. Forward or back. Light or dark. He imagined how ordinary it must have felt until it wasn't. When he left, he didn't look back. The city did what it always does with stories that resist endings. It absorbed them into infrastructure. Into cautionary whispers. Into the way people unconsciously cross streets at night. No plaque was installed. No memorial erected. Just a name that surfaced occasionally in training seminars. A case study in missed patterns. In fragmented data. In how violence can live between categories and therefore between consequences. Every few years, someone still called the unit. A late memory. A dream. A resemblance. Each time, the file was reopened, reviewed, closed again. Cold cases don't end. They settle. They become sediment at the bottom of institutional memory, shaping it invisibly. Changing how future cases are read. Teaching officers to listen for what isn't being screamed. The woman's family eventually sold the old house. The hallway light went dark for the first time in decades. Life continued not because justice had been done, but because it had to. In the end, the case left behind no single truth. Only a collection of truths that could not coexist comfortably. That a man likely did it. That he was never convicted. That he was not alone in what he represented. That the city helped by looking away. London has always been good at that. Looking past. Moving on. Letting footsteps fade into traffic. But sometimes, late at night, when rain slicks the pavement and shop lights reflect in broken patterns, there is a feeling that the city remembers anyway. Not as a story. Not as a headline. As a hesitation. A moment when someone slows down without knowing why. 10 seconds. Just long enough to feel watched. Just short enough to keep walking. By the time the 30th anniversary passed, the case had become something else entirely. Not an investigation. Not a scandal. A reference point. A quiet example used in lectures about pattern blindness and institutional drift. A reminder that danger does not always announce itself with urgency. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it waits for permission. Permission had been given freely in the 80s. Given by haste. By underfunding. By the assumption that survival meant insignificance. The city had taught itself to triage fear. Young officers learned about the case in fragments. A slide in a presentation. A paragraph in a training manual. They were told to look for clusters, to resist the urge to isolate, to question categories that felt too neat. The woman's name appeared once, then was replaced by a case number. Even memory, eventually, becomes procedural. And yet, the file refused to stay inert. In 2031, a routine digitization project uncovered an anomaly. Audio tapes from the late 80s, converted from analog to digital, processed through noise reduction software that hadn't existed when they were first recorded. Most were unusable, voices flattened, static amplified. But one tape, mislabeled and misdated, emerged clearer than expected. It was not an interview. It was a voicemail, left on a public tip line 3 weeks after the murder. The original log described it as incoherent. Male voice. Heavy breathing. No actionable information. It had been dismissed within minutes of review and filed away. The cleaned audio told a different story. The breathing was not panic. It was control. The voice spoke slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each word. He did not name himself. He did not name her. He spoke about streets, about rain, about timing. He said some people walked like they thought they were invisible. He said London was full of blind corners. He said the city made things easy if you paid attention. Then he laughed. Not the brittle laugh from the interview tape. Not nervous. Not brief. Satisfied. The message ended with a sentence that had been swallowed by static the first time around. She almost made it. The analyst who heard it sat back in her chair and didn't move for a long time. She replayed it, slowed it, compared it to archived recordings of the defendant's voice. The cadence matched. The pauses matched. The rhythm of confidence matched. Voice comparison was not proof. It never would be. But it was not nothing. The unit convened quietly. No announcements. No press. Just a room full of people who understood exactly what they were hearing and exactly why it could not be used. The caller had never identified himself. The tape could not be authenticated beyond doubt. The man it most resembled was dead. Still, it changed how they spoke about the case. Not a likely offender anymore. A probable one. Language shifted again. The voicemail transcript was added to the sealed report. It joined the maps, the ledger, the patterns, the almosts. A chorus of fragments that would never harmonize into certainty, but no longer sounded random. The family was told. They listened to the recording once. They declined a copy. For them, the sentence did what no verdict had managed. It collapsed possibility into something closer to truth. Not justice. Not closure. But recognition. She had been seen. She had been noticed. She had fought time. That knowledge carried a weight of its own. The journalist returned to the story years later, this time writing not about the crime, but about the voicemail. About how institutions decide what counts as noise. About how confidence, when stripped of urgency, can sound like nonsense. The piece circulated among professionals, prosecutors, psychologists, policymakers. It changed nothing publicly. Privately, it unsettled many. Because the voice was not angry, not cruel. It was proud. Pride suggested intent. And intent, once acknowledged, demanded questions no one could answer anymore. Did he plan it, or did he improvise? Did he choose her, or did he choose the street? Did he stop because he wanted to, or because he had to? The city offered no replies. Years passed. Generations shifted. The shop, the bus stop, the alley, all became footnotes. People walked those streets without knowing why they felt exposed there. Only that they did. Architecture remembers even when people forget. On one rainy evening, decades after the murder, a young woman stopped at the cafe that now occupied the old shopfront. She paid. She turned to leave. She felt something tighten in her chest for no reason she could name. She hesitated, then waited until another customer exited with her. Nothing happened. But the case had done its work anyway. Not by solving itself, but by teaching. Teaching caution without paranoia. Teaching attention without obsession. Teaching that some threats do not roar. They pace. They measure. They wait until it's quiet. The cold case unit closed the file again in 2035, marking it as historically resolved, legally unresolved. A compromise that satisfied no one and offended no statute. The file was moved to deep storage, its barcode scanned one final time. The last note added was not evidentiary. It was philosophical. This case demonstrates the danger of asking the wrong question. Not who did it, but why it took so long to listen. Because in the end, the most unsettling truth was not that one man likely walked away from a murder. It was that he walked for years before that, just behind women who sensed him but could not name him. And that the city, loud and crowded and alive, had room enough for that silence. Room enough for 10 seconds. Room enough for a shadow that never needed to run. Room enough for a crime that didn't look like one until it was far too late. The voicemail altered the temperature of the case in ways that statistics never could. It did not reopen proceedings. It did not change the verdict. It did something quieter and more corrosive. It removed ambiguity from motive. It suggested not accident, not confusion, not a momentary loss of control, but awareness, presence, enjoyment. Enjoyment was harder to dismiss. Within the unit, discussions shifted from evidence to implication. If the caller had spoken 3 weeks after the murder, then the act had not ended on the street. It had followed him home. It had lingered. He had replayed it. He had wanted someone to know, even if they didn't understand. Especially if they didn't understand. The voicemail was analyzed the way one studies handwriting in an unsigned letter. Word choice. Pacing. What was not said. He never used the word kill. Never used the word dead. He spoke only of distance, timing, nearness, as if the outcome were incidental, less important than the process. That distinction mattered. It reframed the earlier assaults, the almosts, the pauses, the women who had complied and been released. Control was not a means. It was the goal. The murder was not the point. It was a deviation, a breach in his own rules. That made it more frightening, because it meant the case wasn't about a man who snapped. It was about a man who practiced. The psychologist returned to the file, adding an addendum to his earlier profile. He wrote about offenders who derive satisfaction from proximity without consequence, about how cities, with their anonymity and density, provide rehearsal spaces. He wrote that such individuals often experience a moment of crisis when control fails, and that afterward, they either escalate or retreat permanently. Retreat had been mistaken for reform. The journalist read the addendum and didn't publish it. She didn't need to. By then, the case had become a quiet undercurrent in professional circles. It surfaced in workshops about victim reporting, in debates about threshold crimes, in discussions about why certain complaints never cross into investigation. The phrase "she almost made it" began appearing in margins, not quoted, not attributed, just written, as if it summarized something larger than the case itself. Almost was where the system lived. Almost serious enough. Almost violent enough. Almost provable. The family avoided anniversaries now. They had learned that time did not soften them. It sharpened them. Each year added another layer of interpretation. Another revelation that arrived too late to matter in the way that counted. What remained was presence. They felt it in the way strangers sometimes mention the case without knowing who they were. In the way people assumed closure existed somewhere, filed under a different name. In the way the city continued to tell the story as an exception rather than a warning. The street itself resisted that framing. Urban planners working on a redevelopment proposal noted an unusual pattern in pedestrian flow near the old alley. People unconsciously avoided it at night, even those unfamiliar with the history. The path was technically efficient, well-lit, visible, and yet it repelled. Behavioral economists called it irrational avoidance. The detective, long retired, would have disagreed. He believed places learn. Not in memory, in pressure. A city absorbs events the way ground absorbs rain. Most of it drains away. Some of it settles deeper, changing the soil. You don't see it until years later, when nothing quite grows the same. In 2040, a new cold case unit head ordered a review of all historic, no-crime reports involving following behavior. Hundreds surfaced. Most were benign. Some were not. Patterns emerged that mirrored the old case too closely to ignore. Policies changed quietly. Follow-up protocols were introduced. Language guidelines revised. Officers trained to document presence, not just action. To record fear as data, not noise. No one cited the 1987 case publicly. Everyone knew it anyway. The voicemail remained sealed, but its existence became an open secret. In lectures, instructors would say, there was a case where the offender told on himself and no one heard it. They didn't need to add details. The point landed without them. Because the most unsettling aspect of the voicemail was not what it revealed about him. It was what it revealed about listening. The analyst who had first cleaned the tape left the unit a year later. In her exit interview, she said the work had changed how she heard the world. She found herself pausing longer on silences, rewinding conversations, listening for intention where others heard clutter. She said it made life heavier. She said she wasn't sure that was a bad thing. On a damp evening not unlike the one decades before, a different woman walked the same stretch of road. She did not know the history. She did not feel watched. She did not hesitate. Nothing followed her. But somewhere nearby, another person slowed their pace to match hers. They stayed behind. Not close. Not obvious. They watched. Nothing happened. The city absorbed it. And that was the point. Because the legacy of the case was not fear. It was awareness of how easily fear could be postponed. How often danger announces itself quietly, politely, waiting for acknowledgement that never comes. The cold case had taught that violence does not always demand attention. Sometimes it waits for it. By the time the file reached its 50th year, it had become part of the institution's conscience. A story told when budgets were cut, when categories were debated, when someone suggested that certain reports were a waste of time. Someone else would say, not loudly, "Remember London." And the room would pause. Not because everyone agreed, but because everyone knew what that pause contained. 10 seconds. A shop door closing. Footsteps aligning. A city full of people, none of them looking back. And a voice, calm and certain, speaking into a machine because he believed, correctly, that no one would truly listen. Not then. Not yet. By the time anyone spoke openly about legacy, the case had already escaped its own file. It lived in procedures, in phrasing, in the way new officers were taught to pause before dismissing a complaint that didn't fit a template. It lived in the hesitations of analysts who replayed audio one more time than necessary, and in detectives who walked routes themselves instead of trusting maps. Legacy is what remains when answers don't. The woman at the center of it all had become almost abstract in these discussions. Not erased, but transformed. Less a person, more a point of origin. A coordinate from which lines radiated outward into policy, psychology, and institutional memory. Some found that uncomfortable. Others found it unavoidable. The family noticed the shift first. They were contacted less frequently now, but when they were, the questions had changed. Fewer requests for photographs. Fewer appeals for emotional quotes. More technical inquiries. Timelines. Habits. Micro details that had once seemed trivial and were now treated like fragile artifacts. What time did she usually leave work? Which side of the street did she walk on? Did she ever change routes when it rained? They answered when they could. When it didn't feel like reopening a wound that had learned to scar over. They had stopped hoping for justice in the traditional sense. Hope, they learned, exhausts itself when fed too long on maybes. What they wanted now was accuracy. That whatever story survived would be closer to the truth than the one that had failed her in 1987. Accuracy, however, is not immune to distortion. As years passed, the case attracted interpretations. Documentaries that never aired. Scripts that circled the story but pulled away at the last moment. Everyone wanted the arrest. The voicemail. The ring. The limp. Fewer wanted the ambiguity that followed. Producers asked for villains and heroes. The case offered neither. It offered a man who likely did it and a system that almost certainly let him. It offered survivors who were told they were lucky. It offered a city that preferred clean narratives to messy vigilance. That made it difficult to sell. And yet, the case endured. In 2047, a retired archivist came forward with something unexpected. During a routine clearance of municipal storage decades earlier, she had salvaged a box marked for disposal. Inside were personal effects from closed investigations. Not evidence. Not officially important. Just items no one had claimed. Among them was a cassette. Not labeled. Not logged. Not cataloged. She had kept it out of instinct more than intent. Something about the weight of it. The way it felt deliberate. Years later, after reading an article about the voicemail, she wondered if it mattered. The unit listened. The tape contained a recording made at home. Background noise. A radio playing softly. A man speaking, not to anyone else, but to himself. He described a walk. The rain. The timing of lights. He described how people changed speed when they felt observed. How some sped up. How others slowed down, hoping that politeness would protect them. He said politeness was a mistake. He never named the street. He never named the woman. But he said something that froze the room. She thought if she got to the bus, it would be over. The voice was older than on the voicemail. Calmer. More reflective. Not triumphant. Not regretful. Analytical. It sounded like rehearsal. There was no date on the tape. No way to prove when it had been recorded or by whom. The archivist could only say it came from a batch cleared in the early 90s. That it had no reason to exist in official storage. That it shouldn't have survived at all. The unit faced a familiar problem. They believed it. They could not use it. The tape joined the others in sealed silence. Another fragment of a confession never meant for court. Another piece of a puzzle that refused assembly. But its impact was immediate. The phrase, "she thought if she got to the bus," echoed through every prior assumption. It aligned too neatly with the bus driver's testimony, with the detour, with the hesitation, with the 10 seconds that had always felt heavier than evidence. For the first time, the timeline didn't just make sense. It felt inhabited. The unit updated the internal narrative again, careful not to cross lines they could not uncross. The language tightened. The doubt narrowed. The description of the likely offender shifted from speculative to behavioral certainty. Still no charges. Still no trial. Just a clearer shadow. The archivist never spoke publicly. She returned to her quiet life, having released what she carried. The analyst who logged the tape wrote a note to herself that never entered the system. Some people confess to machines because machines don't judge. That note stayed in a private notebook, but its truth spread. The case became a reference in discussions about non-human witnesses, about how people speak differently when they believe they are unobserved, about the false comfort of thinking that silence equals absence. A silence the case taught can be deliberate. The city responded in its own way. Public transport authorities adjusted lighting around older stops, not citing crime, citing safety. Urban designers widened sight lines, trimmed hedges, removed blind corners where possible. No one said why. The changes blended into progress. No memorial bore her name, but her absence shaped the city anyway. On anniversaries now, there were no headlines, no fresh retrospectives, just a quiet uptick in internal training emails, a reminder sent, a case mentioned, a lesson reinforced. The family marked the day privately. A walk, a meal, a moment of stillness. They had learned that public memory is fickle, but private memory endures with a different discipline. They no longer asked who. They asked how many chances there had been to interrupt. The answer was never small. As the decades stretched on, the case became less about one night and more about a sequence of decisions that had nothing dramatic about them at the time. A report minimized. A tape dismissed. A complaint categorized away. A laugh not questioned. Each one reasonable. Each one insufficient. Together, catastrophic. London did not apologize. Cities never do. They adapt. They layer meaning until the original event is barely visible beneath infrastructure and habit. But every so often, a new officer would walk that stretch late at night and feel something he couldn't name. A sense of being measured, of footsteps that once aligned there with purpose. He would check his pace. He would look back. Nothing would be there. And yet, the case would be doing its work, not solving itself, but refusing to be harmless. Refusing to stay a story about the past. Insisting, quietly, that attention is not a reaction. It is a responsibility. One that had been deferred for 10 seconds in 1987. One that echoed still. By the time the city reached the year it preferred to call modern, the case had outlived everyone directly involved in it. Detectives retired. Analysts moved on. Journalists found newer silences to interrogate. Even the family thinned, generations stepping back from a grief they had inherited but never experienced firsthand. What remained was institutional memory. And institutional memory, unlike human memory, does not fade. It hardens. The case file was now mostly digital, its contents layered with annotations, metadata, internal warnings. A red flag appeared automatically whenever a new report involved following behavior, proximity without contact, control without immediate violence. A quiet algorithmic echo of a woman who never made it home. Technology had learned what people once ignored. In 2053, a routine audit of historic failures was commissioned, the kind ordered after unrelated scandals to prove accountability without admitting guilt. The 1987 case appeared as an appendix, not highlighted, not dramatized. Just there like a fault line running under several decades of policing culture. The audit concluded that the failure was not investigative skill. It was imagination. Officers had been trained to look for crimes that announced themselves. Assaults, break-ins, weapons. They were not trained to recognize rehearsal, to see patience as threat, to understand that fear, reported early, is not hysteria but data. The language used in the 80s came under scrutiny. Phrases like no further action and victim not credible were dissected, not as relics of a cruel era, but as tools that had functioned exactly as designed, to reduce complexity, to manage workload, to keep the system moving. Efficiency had been lethal. The audit was never published in full. Its recommendations were absorbed quietly into training modules, policy revisions, budget justifications. No one wanted a headline that suggested the city had learned too late. But inside the unit, one line was circled repeatedly. The offender was present long before the offense. That sentence reframed everything. It suggested that the murder was not the beginning of violence, but its punctuation. A period at the end of a sentence that had been written in footsteps and glances and silence. A younger analyst, new to the unit, read the file with fresh eyes. She had grown up with warnings her predecessors never received. She had been taught to trust discomfort, to log it, to escalate it. She found it difficult to imagine a time when a woman could report being followed and be told nothing had happened. She asked her supervisor how many similar cases might still be buried. He didn't answer, because numbers would have implied containment. Instead, he told her about the voicemail, the cassette, the maps, the ledger. The way the case had resisted closure not because it lacked truth, but because truth had arrived in forms the system was not built to accept. She asked what justice looked like now. He said justice was no longer the right word. Prevention was. That answer unsettled her more than any confession could have. Because prevention has no ceremony, no verdict, no moment where everyone agrees something has ended. Prevention is invisible success. And invisible success leaves no room for catharsis. The city continued to change. Surveillance expanded. Lighting improved. Data integrated. London became better at seeing itself. Not perfectly. Never completely. But better than it had been when 10 seconds went unnoticed. Crime statistics reflected improvement. So did confidence. And yet, among those who knew the case, there was no celebration. Because improvement did not resurrect the dead. And systems that learn slowly still leave casualties behind them. On the 70th anniversary, there were no commemorations. No press releases. No quiet ceremonies. The date passed like any other. Somewhere, a clock struck midnight. Somewhere, rain fell. But in the cold case unit, a reminder pinged on a screen. 1987, Camden area, unresolved homicide. The analyst paused before clicking past it. She opened the file, scrolled through the layers of interpretation, the maps, the audio transcripts, the internal notes written by people who had believed, suspected, failed, tried again. She stopped at the earliest entry. A witness note from the night of the murder, barely legible, written in haste. Thought I heard someone running. No follow-up. No clarification. Just that. She closed the file. Not because there was nothing left to learn, but because there was nothing left to add. The case had become complete in a way that did not depend on resolution. It had exposed a gap, and that gap had been narrowed, if not closed. The woman's death had been absorbed into the city's operating system, not as a solved problem, but as a constraint. Do not assume silence is safety. Do not assume survival is luck. Do not assume the absence of violence means the absence of intent. Those lessons were now taught without naming her, which was both mercy and failure. As the analyst left the office that night, she took a different route home. Not out of fear, out of habit learned from the stories she carried. She walked where she could see ahead, where footsteps would be visible before they were close, where 10 seconds could not be stolen so easily. Nothing followed her, but the case followed everyone. Not as a ghost, as a correction. A subtle shift in how attention is paid, in how hesitation is respected, in how the city listens when something feels wrong but cannot yet prove it. That was the final inheritance. Not an answer, but a change in posture. London, vast and indifferent, had adjusted the angle of its gaze. Too late for one woman. Early enough, perhaps, for others. And in that narrow space between those two truths, the cold case finally came to rest. Not solved, but no longer alone. Years later, the file was no longer open for answers. It was open for calibration. New recruits encountered it midway through training, not at the beginning and not at the end. Instructors had learned that if you introduce it too early, it feels abstract. Too late, and it feels like an accusation. So they placed it in the middle, right where confidence starts to harden. They never showed the photographs first. They started with timelines, gaps, missed overlaps, 10-second windows circled in red. They asked the room where they would have acted differently. Most hands went up. Always. That was the easy part. Then the instructors asked the harder question. What would you have done if there was no crime yet? The room usually went quiet. Because policing, like most systems, had been built around aftermath. Around bodies, damage, evidence you could hold. This case offered none of that until it was too late. It demanded action based on pattern, on intuition refined into documentation. It asked authority to move before permission felt earned. Some trainees pushed back. They worried about overreach, about false accusations, about becoming the thing the system was designed to restrain. The instructors didn't argue. They played the audio. Not the dramatic parts. Not the breathing. Just the ambient noise. Footsteps at varying distances. The subtle change in cadence when someone is trying not to be heard. The sound of a city at night continuing, indifferent, while one person realizes they are not alone. They let the room sit with that. Then they showed the final report. The one that used words like unsubstantiated and no immediate threat. They asked who felt comfortable signing their name to it. No one ever did. Outside the classroom, the case continued its quieter work. Urban planners referenced it in risk models. Psychologists cited it in papers about pre-incident stress responses. Policy drafts borrowed its language without attribution, phrases softened just enough to avoid blame. The offender was present long before the offense. That sentence appeared again and again, migrating through disciplines. It became less about this case and more about a way of seeing harm as something that gathers momentum, not something that erupts. The family was contacted one final time, decades after the funeral, decades after hope had stopped feeling productive. They were offered access to the audit, the training materials, the legacy the case had created. They declined the documents. But they asked one question. Would it happen the same way now? No one could promise it wouldn't. But they could say it would not be ignored in the same way. That was the closest thing to an apology the system knew how to make. The woman herself existed now only in fragments. A photograph with a crease down the center. A recorded voice that no one played unless they had to. A name used sparingly, out of respect rather than secrecy. Her story had become infrastructure. And infrastructure is invisible when it works. On a night very much like the one she never came home from, a different woman noticed someone matching her pace. She slowed. The footsteps slowed. She crossed the street. They crossed too. She didn't wait for certainty. She stepped into a cafe still open past midnight. She spoke to the staff. She made the call. She used the language she'd been taught. Clear, specific, unemotional. Units responded. Cameras aligned. The person was identified, questioned, logged. No arrest. No headline. Just a record created early enough to matter. The woman went home shaken, but alive. She would never know about the 1987 case. She would never hear the name. She would not think of herself as a continuation of anything. But her safety was not accidental. It was engineered from a failure that had refused to stay buried. Back in the cold case unit, the file's status never changed. Still unresolved. Still open in theory. But its purpose had evolved. It was no longer asking, who did this? It was asking, what did we miss, and are we missing it again? That question had no expiration date. And so the case remained. Not as an unsolved crime, but as a standing warning. A reminder that violence does not begin with impact, but with permission. Permission granted by disbelief, delay, and the quiet comfort of assuming tomorrow will resemble yesterday. The city no longer made that assumption so easily. And somewhere, in that shift, the echo of footsteps finally lost its power to disappear unheard. Time did not close the case. It stretched it. Paper yellowed. Ink softened. But the question sharpened with age, cutting through new layers of bureaucracy, new leadership, new technology. Every system upgrade forced the file to be migrated, and every migration forced someone to read it again. That was how it survived. Not through obsession, but through repetition. A junior analyst noticed something first. Not a clue, not evidence, timing. The intervals between reported incidents. The pauses. The way activity clustered around certain months, then vanished entirely. It looked less like chance and more like a schedule interrupted. She overlaid the dates with public records. Transit strikes. Hospital closures. Construction projects that rerouted foot traffic. Each disruption coincided with a lull. The city had changed the environment. The pattern had adapted. She hesitated before flagging it. Cold cases punish certainty. They train you to doubt your instincts. But she submitted the note anyway, careful, restrained, framed as observation rather than conclusion. It triggered a review. Not dramatic. Not urgent. Just enough to pull the file from the shelf and place it on a desk again. The review team brought in data that didn't exist in 1987. Digitized CCTV archives. Old planning permits. Employment rosters. Volunteer logs. Anything that explained who had legitimate reasons to be present, repeatedly, without raising suspicion. They weren't looking for a monster. They were looking for someone ordinary. Someone whose presence blended into the background of a working city. Someone who benefited from being overlooked. Someone who learned, early on, that attention was dangerous and absence was power. The list narrowed slowly, painfully. Dozens of names crossed out for reasons that felt insufficient but final. Death. Emigration. Infirmity. Alibis built from routine rather than testimony. One name lingered longer than the others. Not because of evidence. Because of proximity. He had worked nights. His routes overlapped the streets. His employment spanned the years of reported incidents and ended abruptly after the murder. No disciplinary record. No complaints that stuck. Just a transfer request to a quieter post, approved without question. The file on him was thin. That worried them more than a thick one ever could. They interviewed former colleagues. Most remembered nothing. A few remembered him as quiet, reliable, always willing to cover shifts. One remembered something else, a habit of watching people leave. Not staring, just noting. At the time, it meant nothing. Decades later, it meant context. The man was alive. Older now. Frail. Living alone in a town where no one knew his history. His days were measured by medication schedules and television programming. He had outlived suspicion by simply waiting. When the request came through to speak with him, it was framed gently. A routine inquiry. Historical clarification. No accusations. No urgency. He agreed immediately. That was the first thing that unsettled them. The interview room was different now. Softer lighting. Cameras everywhere. No smoke. No raised voices. The techniques had evolved, but the objective hadn't. Listen longer than you speak. He answered questions politely. Precisely. He remembered dates that didn't matter and forgot ones that did. He corrected the interviewer once, casually, about a street name that hadn't existed since the early 90s. A slip. Small, but real. They asked him about the woman. He paused. Not long enough to draw attention. Just long enough to be human. He said he'd heard about it at the time. Everyone had. Terrible business. Dangerous city back then. He said her name incorrectly. Just slightly. No one corrected him. The interview ended without confrontation. They let him leave. Outside, the rain had started, tapping softly against the pavement, a sound too familiar to ignore. Inside, the team replayed the footage frame by frame. They didn't look at his words. They looked at his body. The tightening of his hands when certain locations were mentioned. The way his breathing changed when timelines overlapped too closely. Stress tells its own story. They sought warrants. Carefully. Quietly. The threshold was high. The years demanded caution. When they searched his old storage unit, they found nothing illegal. No trophies. No weapons. Just boxes of routine life. And then, in the bottom of one box, a notebook. Not a diary. A log. Times. Routes. Weather. Observations written in a neutral hand. No names. No violence. Just movement recorded with obsessive consistency. It was not proof. But it was rehearsal. The arrest came at dawn. No sirens. No cameras. Just two officers and a knock on a door that had never expected to be open this way. He did not resist. He did not ask why. At the station, the charge was read slowly, carefully, as if the words themselves might fracture under their own weight. 36 years. The city reacted the way cities do, loudly at first, then selectively. Headlines screamed surprise. Commentators argued about memory, about justice delayed, about the ethics of pursuing an old man for a young woman's death. They did not talk about the waiting. They did not talk about the years between. The family was notified. They listened in silence. There was no relief. No closure waiting on the other end of the line. Just confirmation that the question had not been forgotten. That mattered more than resolution. As the case moved forward, the voiceover of the past grew louder. Old interviews replayed. Old doubts resurfaced. The city was forced to watch itself fail in real time, decades late. And in that watching, something shifted. Because a cold case is never just about what happened. It's about what was allowed to happen. And what, finally, is no longer allowed to hide. The arrest did not feel like an ending. It felt like a disturbance. The kind that ripples outward, warping everything it touches. Files once considered inert were suddenly radioactive. Every decision made in the late 80s was re-examined under a modern light that showed too much, too clearly. Names surfaced that had long since retired, relocated, died. Their judgments were now artifacts, preserved and scrutinized without the mercy of context. The prosecution moved carefully. Time is not neutral in court. It erodes certainty, corrodes memory, complicates motive. Witnesses had aged. Some had vanished entirely. Others remembered too well, their recollections sharpened by decades of replay rather than proximity to truth. The defense understood this immediately. They did not argue innocence at first. They argued erosion. They argued contamination. They argued that memory, stretched over 36 years, becomes narrative. That patterns can be imposed where none existed. That a notebook is not a weapon and observation is not intent. They argued that the city had changed, and so had the man. The prosecution countered with accumulation. Not one piece, but many. Not proof in isolation, but pressure in totality. The routes, the timings, the pauses, the fact that his transfers mirrored the disappearance of reports. The way incidents ceased entirely after the night she died. They did not need to prove obsession. They needed to prove presence. And presence, over time, becomes difficult to deny. The courtroom filled with a different kind of audience than the press had anticipated. Not thrill-seekers, not rubberneckers, but people who recognized fragments of themselves in the story. Women who had walked faster without knowing why. Men who remembered being told nothing could be done. Officers who had once filed reports that went nowhere. This was not a spectacle. It was a reckoning conducted in slow motion. The accused sat quietly throughout, posture unchanged, eyes forward. He did not scan the room. He did not react to photographs. When the notebook was displayed, he leaned back slightly, as if recognizing an old acquaintance. He spoke only once, during a procedural clarification. His voice was steady, courteous, almost apologetic. The effect was unsettling. Because monsters are easier to condemn than men who look like they could be anyone's neighbor. Expert witnesses testified about behavior, about escalation, about control as a motivator rather than violence, about how some offenders rehearse their crimes the way others rehearse speeches, incrementally, invisibly, until the act itself feels inevitable. They spoke about waiting, about patience as a weapon. The jury listened, expressionless, absorbing not just facts but implication. That this was not a crime that exploded into existence. It was one that had been permitted to mature. Outside, the city argued with itself. Radio shows debated whether justice delayed was justice denied. Commentators questioned the morality of incarcerating someone near the end of his life. Others asked why it had taken so long for patterns to be believed when the victims had been speaking all along. No one agreed. But no one could look away. The woman's name was spoken aloud again and again, no longer buried in footnotes. Each repetition felt like an act of reclamation. She was not a lesson, not a statistic, not a case study. She was a person who had left a shop and never come home. Her family attended only one day of testimony. They did not stay for arguments. They did not watch the defense cross-examine memory. They had already lived the longest version of waiting possible. When asked later why they came at all, they said they wanted to hear her name in a room that could not ignore it. That was enough. As the trial progressed, something else emerged, quietly, unavoidably. Other reports, other cities, other women who had never connected their experiences to anything larger because no one had given them permission to. A woman from the early 90s recognized a route. Another recognized a phrase. Another recognized the calm. They came forward not as witnesses, but as context. The court allowed it carefully, narrowly, aware of the line between illumination and prejudice. But even within those limits, the picture deepened. Not wider, deeper. This was not about quantity. It was about continuity. The defense tried to reframe the narrative. They emphasized the absence of physical evidence, the lack of DNA, the reliance on interpretation. They reminded the jury that certainty is a luxury the law cannot afford. They were not wrong, but certainty had never been the promise. Accountability was. In closing arguments, the prosecution did not ask the jury to imagine the crime. They asked them to imagine the silence around it. The reports filed and dismissed. The fear normalized. The patterns that went unrecognized because they were inconvenient. They asked the jury to consider what happens when waiting becomes strategy. and who benefits from patience when the system moves slowly. Deliberation took days, not because the evidence was weak, but because the implications were heavy. A verdict either way would not just judge a man. It would judge an era, a methodology, a collective willingness to believe harm without spectacle. When the jury returned, the room held its breath without realizing it had been breathing shallow for weeks. The verdict was read. Guilty. On all counts presented. There was no outburst, no collapse. The accused closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. That was all. Sentencing followed months later. The judge spoke about time not as an excuse, but as an amplifier. About how longevity does not soften impact. About how age does not undo harm. A life sentence was imposed, adjusted for reality. He would likely never leave custody. The city absorbed the outcome the way it absorbs most things, unevenly. Some felt relief. Others felt anger. Many felt something less definable. A sense that a door long thought sealed had finally been opened, revealing not closure, but responsibility. The cold case unit archived the file again. But this time it was different. The status changed. Resolved. The word felt strange on the page. Almost dishonest. Resolution suggests neatness. This had none. It suggested completion. This had only interruption. Still, the designation mattered. It meant the question had been answered, even if the answer came too late to feel victorious. The legacy of the case did not fade with the verdict. If anything, it intensified. Training protocols changed again. Thresholds were lowered for pattern recognition. Language shifted in official reports, replacing dismissal with documentation. Silence was no longer treated as absence. Other cases were reopened, not because of new evidence, but because of new attention. Because the city had learned, belatedly, how to listen. On a quiet street not far from where it began, the cafe closed one evening, and the lights went out. A woman walked alone, phone in hand, steps quick. She glanced over her shoulder, then slowed, trusting the instinct she had been taught not to doubt. Nothing happened. And that, finally, was the point. The case no longer lived in headlines or courtrooms. It lived in prevention, in interruption, in the moments when fear was believed early enough to matter. 36 years after a woman vanished into a city that did not yet know how to protect her, the echo of her absence had reshaped how danger was understood. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The city still remembered the sound of footsteps. But now it listened sooner. And it did not wait. The sentence was handed down, recorded, archived, and reported as fact, but facts are blunt instruments. They land with weight, not meaning. Meaning arrives later, in the quiet after the cameras leave, when systems are forced to live with what they have acknowledged. The man was transferred to a facility designed for age as much as for custody. White corridors, slow routines, medication carts instead of riot shields. His name appeared on no signage. He became a number that required assistance to stand, to eat, to remember the day of the week. Some argued this was mercy. Others called it irony. Neither mattered to the woman who never aged past the night she disappeared. Her family returned to anonymity by choice. They declined interviews, declined anniversaries, declined the strange new role of symbolic survivors. Grief, for them, was not something to be curated for public consumption. It was private, and it had already endured longer than most marriages. What they accepted, quietly, was the correction of the record. Official documents were amended. Language softened decades earlier was replaced with clarity. No immediate threat became credible pattern of predatory behavior. Unsubstantiated became insufficiently investigated. These changes did not undo the past, but they prevented it from repeating itself unchallenged on paper. Paper matters. Policy followed language. Funding followed policy. Units once siloed began sharing data by default instead of exception. The idea that a crime must culminate before it deserves attention began to erode, replaced by something more fragile and more dangerous: trust and judgment. Mistakes would be made. Everyone knew that. But silence would no longer be one of them. The city's relationship with the case shifted again, this time inward. There were no more headlines to chase, no verdicts to anticipate. What remained was reflection. Retrospective documentaries, academic panels, long-form articles dissecting how harm had been allowed to grow unnoticed. The most unsettling conclusion was also the simplest. Nothing about the offender was extraordinary. He did not hide in shadows because he had to. He hid because it worked, because the world around him was optimized to overlook what did not announce itself loudly. Because normalcy, when weaponized, becomes camouflage. This realization unsettled people far more than the verdict ever had. It meant the threat had never been external. It had been ambient. The cold case unit received letters for months afterward. Some thanked them. Some blamed them. Some contained stories that had waited decades for a reason to be told. Each letter was read, logged, answered when possible. The volume did not slow. It had been waiting too. In training rooms, the case was no longer framed as failure. It was framed as transformation, as a hinge point where listening became an action rather than a courtesy, where fear was allowed to be data. Instructors emphasized one moment above all others. Not the murder, not the arrest, but the first report, the one that had been minimized, the one that could have changed everything. They asked trainees to read it aloud and then rewrite it, using only what had been said originally, but with belief. The difference was staggering. Outside institutional walls, the city adapted in its own imperfect ways. Businesses changed lighting. Councils extended night services. Public campaigns avoided panic language and focused instead on permission, to trust instincts, to report early, to insist on being taken seriously. The ripple spread quietly. Years passed. The case stopped being referenced by date and started being referenced by principle. Since London 87 became shorthand in internal memos for a shift in approach, for a refusal to wait for harm to justify attention. The woman's name remained at the center of it, spoken less often now, but never erased. She had become part of the city's moral infrastructure, as real and unseen as wiring behind walls. On the street where it happened, life continued. People laughed outside the cafe. Buses hissed to a stop. Rain came and went. No marker distinguished the pavement from any other. And yet, something had changed. People paused there sometimes without knowing why. They checked reflections, adjusted pace, looked up instead of down. Not out of fear, out of awareness. The case had not taught the city to be afraid. It had taught it to pay attention. That was its final transformation. From tragedy to threshold. From silence to signal. From a woman lost in the noise of 1987 to a presence that shaped how the city listened forever after. The file remained closed. But the lesson stayed open. Waiting, the city had learned, was never neutral.
And it would not wait again.
Time moved forward, but the case moved differently. It did not recede. It diffused. It surfaced in places that had nothing to do with courts or police stations. In university lectures about urban psychology. In architecture journals discussing sightlines and shadow. In software teams building reporting tools that prioritize patterns over incidents. The case stopped being cited as history and started being treated as a condition, something that could recur if ignored. People no longer asked what happened that night. They asked how many nights had felt like it. The city learned to hear the low frequencies. The things that don't trigger alarms but hum underneath daily life. A complaint that doesn't fit a checkbox. A report that sounds unsure because fear rarely arrives with confidence. The absence of escalation, once mistaken for safety, was reclassified as a warning sign. Waiting had been redefined. The man in custody faded from public consciousness quickly. Age does that. So does irrelevance. His appeals were procedural, technical, devoid of narrative. They failed quietly. His name stopped appearing in print. He became what he had always been best at becoming.
Background.
But the machinery he had exploited no longer functioned the same way. Every so often, A journalist tried to revive the story with a new angle, a forgotten detail, a speculative connection. None of it landed. The appetite was gone. Sensation had been replaced by something less marketable but more durable. Understanding. The family marked no anniversaries. They did not visit memorials that did not exist. Their grief had been excavated publicly once. They had no interest in reopening it for strangers. What they carried instead was a quieter knowledge that the woman they loved had not vanished into meaninglessness. Her absence had weight. It bent systems. In a different borough, years later, a supervisor paused over a report that felt too small to matter. No assault. No theft. Just a description of being followed, of footsteps that adjusted, of a presence that withdrew when confronted by light. The supervisor remembered the case without recalling its details. Just the principle. The refusal to minimize. She flagged it. That single action triggered a chain, cross-references, camera checks, patrol adjustments. Nothing dramatic happened. No arrest. No confrontation. But the pattern did not get the chance to grow. That was the new metric of success. Not resolution. Prevention. The city never announced this shift formally. There was no speech, no policy launch that captured public imagination. Change arrived the way it always does, incrementally, unevenly, through people making slightly different choices because something unseen had altered their threshold for doubt. Fear was no longer treated as embarrassment. It was treated as information. The cold case unit eventually dissolved, folded into broader divisions as technology erased the boundaries that had once justified specialization. But the files remained, digitized, tagged, searchable. London 1987 remained one of the most accessed. Not because it was unusual, because it was instructive. New analysts noticed something else over time. A drop. Not in crime overall, but in a specific category that had once been notoriously difficult to track. Incidents that existed in the space before harm. Encounters that ended without injury, but left residue. The numbers did not vanish. They flattened. That mattered. It suggested that attention itself had weight. That being seen early changed trajectories. That predators, deprived of anonymity, often chose silence over escalation. The city had learned how to interrupt. On late nights, in places where light thinned and footsteps echoed, people still felt watched sometimes. That had not changed. It never would. Cities are not safe by default. They are negotiated spaces, constantly renegotiated by those who move through them. What had changed was response. Phones came out faster. Doors were entered sooner. Voices were raised without apology. Reports were filed without waiting for permission from harm. The echo no longer disappeared unheard. Somewhere in the system, a dashboard updated. A dot appeared. Then another. Then enough to justify attention. No one connected it consciously to a woman who never came home in 1987. But the connection existed. In the way decisions were made earlier. In the way doubt was handled differently. In the way waiting lost its authority. The case had done what no verdict could do on its own. It had altered instinct. Long after the legal process concluded, long after the city stopped speaking her name aloud, the influence remained embedded. In training, in design, in reflex, a presence without visibility. This is how cold cases truly end. Not with closure, but with conversion. A conversion of indifference into vigilance, of silence into signal, of hindsight into foresight. The woman's story did not conclude with justice, because justice is a moment and harm is a process. Her story concluded when the process was interrupted often enough to matter. The city still moved fast, still looked forward, still forgot details. But it no longer forgot patterns. And that, in the end, was the quietest kind of reckoning. One that did not need to be announced. One that simply changed what happened next. It ended without ceremony. No final announcement. No closing image. No moment where the city paused to acknowledge that something had finally run its course. Because what had begun in 1987 had never really been a single event. It had been a pressure, a tolerance, a willingness to accept the unclear as insignificant. And pressures don't disappear. They are redistributed. The case file was moved one last time, not into storage but into reference. Its cover no longer marked urgency, only relevance. It became a thing people consulted without thinking about why, the way you check a map without remembering who first drew the roads. London changed again, as it always does. New buildings rose where old ones fell. Streets were renamed. Populations shifted. The city's face refreshed itself, decade by decade, while its memory adapted underneath. The woman's name began to fade from even internal language. Not erased. Absorbed. It lived now inside protocols, thresholds, reflexes. In the pause before dismissing a report. In the decision to escalate instead of defer. In the quiet question asked at the right time, what if this matters sooner than we think? That question became habit. And habits are powerful. The man in custody died quietly one winter morning. No announcement followed. No statement was issued beyond a procedural notice. He left behind no confession, no explanation, no moment of revelation that would satisfy the human hunger for clarity. He left behind silence. But silence no longer had the same power it once did. The city did not need his words. It had already learned how to read absence. Somewhere, a woman walked home late. Somewhere else, another changed her route. Somewhere else, a report was taken seriously even though nothing had happened. These moments never made headlines. They never became stories. They accumulated. And accumulation, when it works in the right direction, becomes protection. The cold case that once symbolized failure had completed its final transformation. It no longer represented what had gone wrong, but what must never be allowed to go unnoticed again. Not because systems became perfect, but because disbelief lost its authority. The city still carried shadows. It always would. But it no longer pretended shadows were empty just because they were quiet. It had learned that danger often waits for permission, and permission is something a society gives without realizing it. That permission had been revoked. Long after the rain stopped falling on that street, long after the shop disappeared, long after the echo of footsteps blended into traffic, something remained. Not fear, not grief. Attention. A collective, sharpened attention that moved through the city like an undercurrent, unseen but persistent, altering outcomes without ever announcing itself. This is how the story finally ends. Not with justice triumphant. Not with closure declared. But with interruption repeated often enough to become normal. A woman lost in 1987 did not come back. But she changed what happened next. And in a city built on movement, memory, and forgetting, that may be the most lasting form of resolution there is. The case was closed. The listening was not. The city never marked the anniversary. No wreaths. No moments of silence. No official remembrances that risked turning vigilance into ritual. Because rituals can be completed and set aside. What London carried instead was something less visible and more demanding, a state of readiness that did not announce itself, that did not require belief in a single story, only respect for a pattern. Years after the man's death, a review board revisited the case one final time. Not to reassess guilt, not to reopen wounds, but to understand trajectory. How a single, miscategorized report had expanded into decades of harm. How language, once chosen for convenience, had shaped response. How disbelief had functioned as policy without ever being written down. They produced no public report. They didn't need to. The conclusions had already been absorbed. The city had internalized a new reflex, to treat unease as data, to treat repetition as signal, to treat silence not as absence but as compression, pressure building where no one is looking. That reflex moved with people as they changed jobs, retired, relocated. It migrated beyond London, beyond policing, into transit authorities, into education, into design, into everyday decisions made by individuals who had never heard the woman's name and never needed to. The case no longer belonged to a unit or an archive. It belonged to behavior. Late one night, years after everything had supposedly ended, a call came in from a residential street. A man loitering. No threats. No crime. Just watching. Just waiting. The response was swift, measured, ordinary. The man left before officers arrived. Nothing followed. And yet, somewhere in the system, a note was made. A timestamp. A description. A presence logged early enough to exist. That was the difference. Not the chase. Not the capture. The interruption. Cold cases are often described as ghosts, unfinished business that haunts the living. But this one did something rarer. It reversed the haunting. It taught the living how to recognize danger before it demanded blood to be believed. It taught the city that the most dangerous moment is often the one that looks like nothing at all. The woman did not become a symbol in the way symbols usually work. She was not simplified, not flattened into inspiration or tragedy. Her impact was quieter, more exacting. She forced attention forward. She forced systems to ask earlier questions. She forced the city to stop confusing calm with safety. And so the story does not end with her. It moves through every decision made a few seconds sooner than before. Through every report taken seriously on the first telling. Through every instinct trusted before harm could justify it. That is the legacy no headline can capture. A city that learned, too late for one woman, but early enough for countless others, that listening is not passive. It is an act. And when repeated, night after night, street after street, it becomes the difference between a case that waits 36 years to be solved and one that never needs to exist at all. The city keeps walking, but it listens now, and it does not wait.